Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum dear students. Here again we are going to continue with the novel Great Expectations. We would continue part 2 of the novel. Before I go into the details of today's session, I would like to share a quick review of the previous session. In the previous session, I introduced part 2 of the novel. We covered 10 chapters, that is from chapter 1 to 10 of this part of the novel. We explored the text of these chapters, we looked at the themes and saw the development of characters. I presented some critical analysis points with reference to the text, and I also discussed some important points in relation to the development of plot through these chapters. With this we come to our today's session, and our today's session would cover chapter 11 onwards till the end of part 2. Well, chapter 11 of part 2 has the following as important points in it. Pip and Jaggers return to the inn in the town. Pip tells Jaggers that Orlick should not be trusted by Miss Havisham. Jaggers assures Pip that he will ensure that Orlick is fired from the job. Pip avoids Joe and Biddy. Remember in the previous chapter that was in the previous session, Pip had decided after meeting Estella that he would not see Joe and Biddy, so he avoids Joe and Biddy and he stays away from the forge. He walks around the town and enjoys how people look at him with admiration. However, soon this pleasant walk is disturbed by the trap boy who makes fun of Pip. He copies the snobbish way of Pip, the snobbish way how Pip walks, and shouts, "Don't know ya?" to onlookers. So Pip returns to London and talks to Herbert about Estella. Herbert also shares that he too loves a woman named Clara, and he tells Pip that it is to be kept as a secret, as his mother would not like it, considering his marriage to be done in a family that is beneath the status of Herbert's family. So again, the issue of social status, the theme of social class comes in here at this point. Let us look at some text from this chapter that would be an indication of Pip's snobbery. It was interesting to be in the quiet old town once more, and it was not disagreeable to be here and there suddenly recognized and stared after. One or two of the tradespeople even darted out of their shops and went a little way down the street before me, that they might turn as if they had forgotten something and pass me face to face, on which occasions I don't know whether they or I made the worse pretense. They of not doing it, और I of not seeing it. तो अब क्या हो रहा है, हर कोई सिर्फ पिप ही conscious नहीं है, हर कोई there in the small village, everybody is conscious about Mr. Pip as he is now. Pip snobbishly is moving around, he is enjoying how people look at him, suddenly recognizing and staring after him. And then there would be some people who out of curiosity would, you see, move a few steps ahead और फिर एकदम से पीछे मुड़ेंगे, जैसे अचानक पीछे मुड़े और यूं गुजरेंगे जैसे उन्होंने पिप को रिकग्नाइज नहीं किया, कोई बात भूल गए हों, और पिप अपनी तरफ से इस तरह से प्रिटेंड करेगा जैसे उनको नहीं देखा. All this setting shows the snobbish attitude of Pip on one hand, and on the other hand the artificiality of Pip's personality as it has developed in him. As far as the people are concerned, on their part, how they are being impressed by a person who, according to them or for them, who belongs to the upper class now, this is a point of consideration for us as readers. Anyhow, the text continues. Still my position was a distinguished one, and I was not at all dissatisfied with it until fate threw me in the way of that unlimited miscreant Trabb's boy. So the Trabb's boy who would make fun of him on this, and this is a harsh criticism by Dickens on snobbish people that he does through the ridicule of Pip. Some important discussion points with reference to this chapter include theme of guilt versus social demands. It is in accordance with the demands of the society that Pip continues to make decisions on how he would react towards Joe and Biddy. He decides not to see Joe and Biddy while he is in his hometown. However, we notice that he is torn apart by mixed feelings. His snobbery does not allow him to have the same relationship with Joe and Biddy, but on the other hand, he has the feeling of guilt which makes him regret the same decisions. This is an indication that whatsoever his actions may be, but he has a, this is a typo error, so actually what it means is, but he has a conscience. Dickens has very craftily used the trap boys' pranks to make Pip realize a lot. It also is a means to convey a lot to the reader. Pip is ashamed of, he feels ashamed of what he has done to Biddy and Joe. Pip feels he has become a parody, a proud peacock who does not know ya. On the other hand, as he tells Herbert that he is not ready to let it go. So again, the conflict is there. There is the artificial life of London that is, you see, attracting Pip, that is demanding from Pip a certain kind of attitude. There are the demands of the society he moves in. These social demands are very much in contrast with the demands of his own conscience, which is, you see, the conscience of a man who feels guilty at doing wrong to his relations, doing wrong to people like Biddy and Joe. There is another theme of nature versus society that is important. So I have actually, what I have done here is I have presented the theme of society in two ways. One, the society demands versus guilt, the other society versus nature. This theme of nature versus society emerges as Pip tries to be what Estella and society would like him to be. In doing so, he goes against his nature. By nature, he is good. How do we know that? We know it from the very beginning. We have seen him as a young boy. We have seen him in the marshes, in the graveyard, helping the convict, bringing food and file for him. And we have seen the good nature of this boy who innocently, simply and good-heartedly asks the convict, do you enjoy the food? And now we see a Pip who has the pressure of society that demands him to change. So in doing so, he goes against his nature, but he finds himself helpless as he cannot let go his desire for Estella. So on the one hand is the desire to have Estella, to be united with Estella, for which he needs to meet the demands of the upper class social setup. On the other hand is his nature that is simple, that is sympathetic, and that is pure, as we already have discussed with reference to his childhood. This leads us to chapter 12's some important points. Herbert and Pip go to see Wopsle in Hamlet, which turns out to be a horrible piece of theatre. However, it is a very humorous evening anyways because of the crowd's wisecracks. They invite Wopsle home for dinner and listen to him making his high claims about his performance. So without much contribution towards the main plot, this chapter leads way to the next chapter. But before we go to the next chapter, there are some discussion points with reference to Dickens' work as a satirist. Dickens is a satirist, and here again he has used this tool of satire to point out the flaws of the overacted theatre of his times. He presents a light-hearted critique of the theatrical performances and their shallowness in his times. Wopsle's Hamlet is a laugh out loud comedy, and there is a lot of overacting in it, and actually Dickens has made fun of all this. There is also an autobiographical element in this. Dickens was an actor and a producer of theatrical productions himself, so his personal experience as an actor and as a producer of these kind of theatrical works is reflected in this whole episode. With this we come to chapter 13 of part 2. Chapter 13 shows us that Pip receives a letter from Estella. In the letter she orders him to meet her at a London train station. In her anxiousness to meet her, he arrives very early at the train station. As he waits there, and still quite a few hours remain in the arrival of Estella, by chance he encounters Wemmick there. Now that he meets Wemmick, Wemmick proposes to take him on a brief tour of the miserable grounds of Newgate Prison. Well, if you remember the first visit of Pip to London, as soon as he reached London, if you can recall, he saw the prison gate, and it was the same Newgate Prison that was quite symbolic, I said at that time point, and now you can again see that the same setting is brought back. Pip agrees to go, but as he reaches there, he feels uncomfortable in the dismal surroundings. But Wemmick is oddly at home. This is quite awkward, this is quite unnatural actually, to find Wemmick to be very comfortable and at home in the setting of the jail. Even introducing Pip to a man who has been sentenced to death by hanging, we could notice how comfortable Wemmick is. As Pip returns to wait for Estella, he wonders at the fact that things associated with the criminal element have strangely intercepted his life at various times, starting with the convict at the beginning of the story of Pip, from the very beginning, from very childhood, where he met the convict in the marshes, to this point. As I have already mentioned at various time points, that the element of criminality, we always find it seeping into his life. He feels as if the stain of criminality is still on him from his visit to Newgate Prison, and how that contrasts with the beautiful Estella. We need again to see, on one hand is the beautiful, yet I would say proud Estella, and on the other hand this Newgate Prison that is a reminder of criminality, that is a reminder of guilt, and of course that is a reminder of many other negative connotations, in contrast with the beautiful Estella. As the carriage of Estella reaches, Pip once again sees a familiar expression in Estella's face, but cannot figure it out yet. Still it is a mystery, so the theme of mystery also continues. Here I am going to share some opening text of chapter 13 for your better understanding of what happens. One day when I was busy with my books and Mr. Pocket, I received a note by the post, the mere outside of which threw me into a great flutter, for though I had never seen the handwriting in which it was addressed, I divined whose hand it was. It had no set beginning as "Dear Mr. Pip" or "Dear Pip" or "Dear Sir" or "Dear anything," but ran thus: I am to come to London that day after tomorrow by the midday coach. I believe it was settled you should meet me. At all events, Miss Havisham has that impression, and I write in obedience to it. She sends you her regard. Yours, Estella. I would like to stop here for a while, and I would like you to think of this letter in comparison and contrast with the letter that was written by Biddy. Biddy's letter had a proper address: Dear Mr. Pip. Estella is rude enough not to start with any term of address, be it a formal one or informal one. So we do not find "Dear Mr. Pip" or "Dear Pip" or "Dear Sir" or "Dear anything" at the outset of the letter. It directly, straightforwardly, abruptly, I would say, starts with the message she is supposed to convey, and in a mechanical tone it is conveyed. And again the misconception about Miss Havisham continues. At all events, Miss Havisham has that impression, and I write in obedience to it. Again, leads towards the role of Miss Havisham as the probable, as the possible benefactor or the sponsor of Pip. So it is supposed that he is to obey the orders of Miss Havisham, and this is also supposed not only by the reader but also by Pip. Anyhow, the text continues. If there had been time, I should probably have ordered several suits of clothes for this occasion, but as there was not, I was fain to be content with those I had. Pip is very, very eager to see Estella. He is very much excited, and again, what we need to notice is the artificiality. He wants to get a lot of suits of clothes stitched, but there is no time, so he has to, you see, be contented with what already he has. What does it show? What kind of impression he wants to create on Estella, of a gentleman, maybe. The text continues, my appetite vanished instantly and I knew no peace or rest until the day arrived. So he knew no peace or rest until Estella would come. The anxiousness, the eagerness can be noticed. Not that its arrival brought me either, for then I was worse than ever and began haunting the coach office in Wood Street, Cheapside, before the coach had left the Blue Boar in our town. For all that I knew this perfectly well, I still felt as if it were not safe to let the coach office be out of my sight longer than 5 minutes at a time. And in this condition of unreason, I had performed the first half hour of a watch of 4 or 5 hours when Wemmick ran against me. Pip is so very much eager and conscious about Estella's arrival, that he is not late to receive her, that he reaches there 4 to 5 hours before the coach is supposed to arrive. आधा घंटा तो अब उसने गुजार लिया इस तरह से that he is just looking at the coach office and he is just literally staring at it so that he does not miss the moment when Estella reaches there. But still long hours are yet left, and it is just a coincidence, by chance it happens so that Wemmick comes there. So as I have already said, that Wemmick offered him to have a small tour, a brief tour of the prison, the Gateway prison, and Pip has agreed for that to kill time. This is some part of the text from the same chapter, that is chapter 13, and it shows the experience of this prison tour. The narrator, Pip, says, it struck me that Wemmick walked among the prisoners much as a gardener might walk among his plants. This was first put into my head by his seeing a shoot that had come up in the night and saying, what, Captain Tom, are you there? Ah, indeed. And also, is that Black Bill behind the Kiston? Why I didn't look for you these 2 months? How do you find yourself? Equally in his stopping at the bars and attending to anxious whisperers, always singly, Wemmick with his post office, that is a reference to his post office face, mouth, in an immovable state, looked at them while in conference, as if he were taking particular notice of the advance they had made, since last observed, towards coming out in full blow at their trial. It shows the disconcern, it shows the cruelty, it shows the strange kind of cruel impact of the prison on the personality of Wemmick, that he has started feeling comfortable and he treats all the cruel happenings in the prison as something very, very normal. He was very popular, he was highly popular, and I found that he took the familiar department of Mr. Jagger's business, though something of the state of Mr. Jagger's hung about him too. Forbidding approach beyond certain limits. His personal recognition of each successive client was comprised in a nod, and in his settling his hat a little easier on his head with both hands, and then tightening the post office, that is his face, with a tightened face, and putting his hands in his pockets. So the way he was treating the prisoners, the way he was exchanging greetings with them, all that is a shock for Pip. In one or two instances, there was difficulty respecting the raising of fees, and then Mr. Wemmick, backing as far as possible from the insufficient money produced, said, "It's no use, my boy, I am only a subordinate. I can't take it. Don't go on in that way with the subordinate. If you are unable to make up your quantum, my boy, you had better address yourself to a principal. There are plenty of principals in the profession, you know, and what is not worth the while of one may be worth the while of other. That's my recommendation to you, speaking as a subordinate. Don't try on useless mayors. Why should you? Now, who's next?" So the mechanical, the cruel, corrupted treatment, I would say. Thus, we walked through Wemmick's greenhouse until he turned to me and said, "Notice the man I shall shake hands with." I should have done so without the preparation, as he had shaken hands with no one yet. So, almost as soon as he had spoken, a portly, upright man, whom I can see now as I write, in a well-worn olive-coloured frock coat with a peculiar pallor overspreading the red in his complexion and eyes that went wandering about when he tried to fix them, came up to a corner of the bars and put his hand to his hat, which had a greasy and fatty surface like cold broth, with a half serious and half jocose military salute. "Colonel, to you," said Wemmick. "How are you, Colonel?" "All right, Mr. Wemmick." Everything was done that could be done, but the evidence was too strong for us, Colonel. "Yes, it was too strong, sir, but I don't care." "No, no," said Wemmick coolly, "you don't care." Then turning to me, "Served His Majesty, this man was a soldier in the line and bought his disgrace." I said, "Indeed?" And the man's eyes looked at me and then looked over my head and then looked at all around, and then he drew his hand across his lips and laughed. "I think I shall be out of this on Monday, sir," he said to Wemmick. "Perhaps," returned my friend, "but there's no knowing." "I'm glad to have the chance of bidding you goodbye, Mr. Wemmick," said the man, stretching out his hand between two bars. Actually, this is the man who's going to be sentenced soon. "Thank ye," said Wemmick, shaking hands with him. "Same to you, Colonel." If what I had upon me when taken had been real, Mr. Wemmick," said the man, unwilling to let his hand go, "I should have asked the favour of your wearing another ring in acknowledgement of your attentions." "I'll accept the will for the deed," said Wemmick. "By the by, you were quite a pigeon fancier." The man looked up at the sky. "I'm told you had a remarkable breed of tumblers. Could you commission any friend of yours to bring me a pair? Or if you have no further use for them?" It shall be done, sir." "All right," said Wemmick. "They shall be taken care of. Good afternoon, Colonel." "Goodbye." They shook hands again, and as we walked away, Wemmick said to me, "A coiner, a very good workman. The recorder's report is made today and he's sure to be executed on Monday. Still, you see, as far as it goes, a pair of pigeons are portable property all the same." So you see the corruption taking the property. With that, he looked back and nodded at this dead plant and then cast his eyes about him in walking out of the yard, as if he were considering what other pot would go best in its place. The mechanical, the cruel treatment, which other pot would be a good replacement for this pot, for this plant, as it would be, the pot would be emptied, as the plant would be dead. Well, there are some important discussion points with reference to this chapter. Number one, that Pip realizes how the elements of criminality have always surrounded his life. He also realizes how at different time points in his life he has come across some sort of criminal agents and acts. He remembers how as a young boy he came across the convict that he fed at the beginning of the novel, and then the one-eyed convict that gave him the pound note sent by the first convict. He has not been able to get rid of these shadows of crime, as even now he is involved in men like Wemmick and Jaggers, who are somehow associated with crime and who make convicts their livelihood. As he is at this point of thought, suddenly Estella's carriage arrives. It is ironic that he had been waiting for her for hours, but now that she comes, he is occupied by other thoughts. Narrator Pip is hinting with these thoughts that young Pip's interaction with criminals is not over yet. He is still occupied with those thoughts, and their surprising involvement in his life will continue. Maybe it is a foreshadowing of some more elements of criminality that would have an impact on the life of Pip. Dickens placing the abrupt intervention of Estella's entrance in these thoughts foreshadows a little more specifically. Estella too will have something to do with this criminality. Maybe this is the idea that can come to a keen reader's mind. The upcoming chapters would prove whether it is so or not. This takes us to chapter 14 of part 2. As far as chapter 14 is concerned, we see that Estella is to go on to Richmond. She orders Pip to take her there. She also orders him to arrange for a cup of tea for her, so they sit in a nearby cafe as they wait for the outgoing coach. Estella is supposed to see a wealthy woman in Richmond with a single daughter. She is supposed to teach Estella. So Estella is further going to learn how to behave and act in the upper class. Estella tells Pip that all of the Miss Havisham's relatives hate him because they view Miss Havisham as his benefactor, which further adds to the misunderstandings of Pip regarding his benefactor or his sponsor. They keep on talking negative about him out of their jealousy. This is what Estella tells Pip. However, Estella believes that Miss Havisham has a good view of him. The carriage comes and they ride to Richmond talking of trivial things, and without much addition to the plot, this part of the journey is done. However, this is the opening text of chapter 14. Where we would see Estella, her appearance, her behavior, her attitude towards Pip, etc. In her furred traveling dress, Estella seemed more delicately beautiful than she had ever seemed yet, even in my eyes. Her manner was more winning than she had cared to let it be to me before, and I thought I saw Miss Havisham's influence in the change. We stood in the inn yard while she pointed out her luggage to me, and when it was all collected, I remembered, having forgotten everything but herself in the meanwhile, that I knew nothing of her destination. "I am going to Richmond," she told me. "Our lesson is that there are two Richmonds, one in Surrey and one in Yorkshire, and that mine is the Surrey Richmond. The distance is 10 miles. I am to have a carriage and you are to take me." Please notice, you are to take me. Again, it is a kind of obligation. It is a kind of order on the part of Estella, and an obligation on the part of Pip. "This is my purse and you are to pay my charges out of it." Look at the snobbishness of Estella. "Oh, you must take the purse. We have no choice, you and I, but to obey our instructions." And what is implied, the instructions are by Miss Havisham's. We are not free to follow our own devices, you and I. So at least one thing we find is shared between the two, that is, both of them don't have choices. On their way, they stop and they have some tea, and this part of chapter 14's text shows what happens during that episode of taking tea. The narrator Pip says, "I rang for the tea and the waiter, reappearing with his magic clue, brought in by degrees some 50 adjuncts to that refreshment, but of tea not a glimpse. A tea board, cups and saucers, plates, knives and forks, including carvers, spoons various, salt cellars, a meek little muffin confined with the utmost precaution under a strong iron cover, Moses in the bulrushes typified by a soft bit of butter in a quantity of parsley, a pale loaf with a powdered head, 2 proof impressions of the bars of the kitchen fireplace on triangular bits of bread, and ultimately a fat family urn, which the waiter staggered in with, expressing in his countenance burden and suffering. So what kind of tea was served? A lot of other things, a lot of delicacies and other stuff, such as muffins and butter and mousses and all that, and the triangular pieces or bits of bread that have that impression of the bars of the kitchen fire on them. उसके ऊपर वो जो सलाखों के ऊपर उसको when it is barbecued, the marks baked, the marks are there. All that was there, but Pip couldn't see tea coming in. And finally the tea comes. And how the tea is served? Ultimately a fat family urn, which the waiter staggered in with, expressing in his countenance, showing the expression that it was a burden and he was suffering from that. So you see, the tea with the unpleasant expression it is associated. After a prolonged absence at this stage of the entertainment, he at length came back with a casket of precious appearance containing twigs, the tea leaves. These are steeped in hot water, and so from the whole of these appliances extracted 1 cup of I don't know what for Estella. So we can clearly see Pip disapproves of this kind of tea. And again, what I would like to say is this is bitter criticism by the satirist Dickens on the upper class snobbish social setup, in which you see a lot of artificiality goes into everything. A simple cup of tea would be accompanied with a lot of things, including tea board, cups and saucers and plates and knives and forks and spoons and a lot of other stuff. And the real thing, that is the tea in this case, would not be of quality. The bill paid and the waiter remembered, and the ostler not forgotten, and the chambermaid taken into consideration. In a word, the whole house bribed into a state of contempt and animosity, and Estella's purse much lightened, we got into our post coach and drove away. And the narrator Pip winds this episode up by saying that a heavy bill was paid for that. Tips were given to the waiter, the ostler, the chambermaid, everybody was given money. And unnecessary use of money, rather wastage of money, is indicated all through this. After wasting so much money for nothing but for a cup of tea, about which Pip said that he extracted 1 cup of I don't know what for Estella. For that cup of tea, spending a lot of money, finally they left. This leads us to chapter 15 of part 2. Pip feels guilty regarding 2 things. Firstly, he feels guilty about his own treatment of Joe and Biddy, whom he has continuously ignored. Secondly, he feels guilty for leading Herbert into a life of debt. He thinks that it was because of him carrying Herbert along on a very expensive lifestyle of dinners, drinks and shows that he is in heavy debt. Pip describes his life at Bernard's Inn with Herbert. We spent as much money as we could and got as little for it as people could make up their minds to give us. We were always more or less miserable, and most of our acquaintances were in the same condition. Our case was in the last aspect a common one. What we can notice is again a satire on the artificiality of the modern life, on the elite class life, where people are spendthrifts, where people waste a lot of money, and again then they waste it just out of their snobbish behavior and out of their show off for having so much money, but actually they do not get anything in return of that money. Anyhow, both of them check their affairs by checking their bills and realize that they are heavily in debt. One such evening, Pip receives a letter announcing the death of his sister, Mrs. Joe Gargery. So this is the closure of chapter 15 that announces the death of Pip's sister. When it comes to important discussion points with reference to this chapter, theme of guilt becomes important as it resurfaces in this chapter. Pip feels guilty about Joe and Biddy. Apart from them being the only true friends, Pip has met Herbert, and he again, in case of Herbert, finds himself guilty. Pip feels that he is betraying even that relationship that he has with Herbert by forcing him into a high life that he cannot afford. Pip's realization has started. This is a very, very important point. From here we would see onwards Pip quickly, rapidly learning. He would go through disillusionment, he would have realization, self-realization, realization of what is happening around, and he would learn a lot. Anyhow, Pip has started having the realization that the lifestyle he has adopted is the one which alienates him from the people he loves and even alienates him from his true self. Now we come to chapter 16 of part 2. Let us see what happens in this chapter. Pip returns home to attend the funeral of his sister. Ironically, the sad event turns out to be a ridiculous affair because of the boy Trabb, who is the tailor. It is even made worse by the pompous Pumblechook and the foolish Hubbles. Later, however, Joe and Pip sit comfortably by the fire like old times. They share their heartfelt feelings sitting by the fire. Pip finds out that before she died, his sister put her head on Joe and said, "Joe, pardon Pip." Also, Pip manages to find time to go for a walk with Biddy. He asks what she will do now. She tells him she is going to open her own school. Pip promises that he would return soon, but Biddy asserts that Pip will not be returning soon as he promises, on which Pip feels very much insulted. Here are some important discussion points with reference to this chapter. Earlier, Joe claimed that the environment of the forge was a better environment for an honest relationship between he and Pip. If you can recall Joe's visit to Pip when Pip was in London, and if you can also recall the discomfort that it caused for both, how unpleasantly it ended up, how Joe and Pip both felt bad about it, and how Pip was not only unhappy but also was worried about his impression, that how it was going to be affected by the coarse and rough appearance and manners of Joe. Keeping all that in mind, and also keeping in mind the words of Joe that he said before he left London, now we can understand what happens here. When Joe was leaving London, he said to Pip that there Joe was out of place in London. The right place for him was the forge. The right dress for him was his working clothes. The right work for him was the use of his own anvil to hammer the iron to work at his forge. And he was completely out of context, out of his real situation when he was there in London. And he suggested very rightly and very wisely, I would say, that the real connection and the real relationship of Joe and Pip only could be re-established in the same setting back at the forge. Now we see how the words of wisdom that were uttered by Joe, a simple blacksmith there in London, they prove to be true here. Again, now when Pip comes here to the funeral ceremony of his sister, it is only here that the true honest relationship is established between him and Joe again. They sit by the fire and they talk. We notice a few more things. We notice that temporarily Pip is also out of his snobbish mood. He is in accordance with his true nature. And sitting comfortably by the fire, smoking his pipe and talking to Joe without any pretension, he reminds us of the Pip who used to live with Joe and Mrs. Joe working at the forge. Discomfort continues, however, between Pip and Biddy. Talking to Biddy is more like looking into the mirror for Pip. Why? Because he can see his real face, he can see his faults in that. Her honest evaluations of Pip cause him irritation and discomfort. With this we come to chapter 17 of part 2. Let us see what happens in this chapter. Pip comes of age, which means he turns 21. Well, this is a typo error. It is he, not her. You can remove this R. So he turns 21. Now he expects his benefactor to reveal himself or herself. Meanwhile, Jaggers makes an appointment with him for early that evening. In fact, Jaggers does not reveal much. He does not tell Pip anything regarding his benefactor or sponsor. Rather, he informs Pip that he does not know when the benefactor will choose to reveal his or her own identity. This is double O, by the way. The only change so far in the life of Pip after coming of age is that now he is in charge of his own stipend, which is now set at £500 a year. Later, Jaggers, Pip and Herbert dine together at the Bernard Inn. After he leaves, Herbert shares with Pip that he feels as if Pip has done something wrong or a crime that unconsciously he wants to hide. Actually, this is exactly how Pip also feels. Looking at this chapter from the critical perspective, we can say that this chapter is an anticipation of the great expectations that Pip has regarding his benefactor. He is expecting his benefactor to reveal his identity or her identity, and he is really looking forward to see his great expectations fulfilled. This leads to chapter 18 of part 2, and in this chapter we see that Pip goes to Wemmick's castle for dinner once again. We see the recurrent theme of food and meal. Even in the previous chapter we saw Pip having a meal with some people. Now again, Wemmick's castle is a place where he went and where he enjoyed last time, if you can remember. Now again, Pip goes there for a dinner. There he is introduced to Miss Skiffins. She too has a personality and face that resembles that of Wemmick's. Another important thing that takes place is that Pip asks Wemmick for advice on the possibility of how he can give Herbert some of his yearly stipend. Actually, he wants to give him £100 a year, but he wants to keep it anonymous. Again, this shows the good nature of Pip, and because Pip has the feeling of guilt that it is because of him that Herbert is in heavy debt, so he decides to help him. However, he wants to keep it anonymous. Finally, it is with the help of Miss Skiffins' brother, who is in finance, that Wemmick and Pip plan how they can help Herbert. It is decided that Herbert will be given a job with a young merchant, and thus he would be helped financially. This brings us to chapter 19 of part 2. This is a brief and very thin chapter that presents the relationship of Pip and Estella. Currently, Pip is living in the city and she is in Hammersmith. The nature of this relationship can be clearly understood when Pip says, "I suffered every kind and degree of torture that Estella could cause me." On a number of occasions, he accompanies Estella on her frequent visits to Miss Havisham. During these visits, Miss Havisham, out of her hatred for men, talks to Estella about all the hearts that Estella has broken, complete with names and details. As all this happens in Pip's presence, it proves to be a torture for him. Pip's self-deception does not let Pip see things clearly. He blindly interprets this as meaning that after Estella finishes with Miss Havisham's scheme of revenge on men, finally Miss Havisham will bring them together as a reward for each other. Miss Havisham has brought up and trained Estella in such a way that now she cannot love anybody. On the other hand, Miss Havisham is very old and weak now. She needs attention and love despite all her claims of disconcern for love. Ironically, Estella, who is adopted by Miss Havisham, is not capable of giving this love to her as she has never learnt it. Then Pip comes to know that Brummel has started courting Estella. This upsets Pip very much, and this is the note where the chapter comes to an end. Well, there are some important discussion points with relation to this chapter. This chapter shows further movement, further journey from illusion to disillusionment. The chapter highlights Pip's illusions. He still believes that Miss Havisham is his benefactor, is his sponsor, and he believes that soon she will reveal all this. He also dreams that soon she will bring he and Estella together. However, interestingly, we notice that the process of disillusionment is about to start as he admits that he never had 1 hour of happiness in her, that is Estella's, society. So we as readers expect that soon the process of disillusionment would start and Pip would realize what the reality is. This brings us to chapter 20, and in chapter 20 what we see is that Pip has turned 23. Everything in life is going on a very slow pace. He seems to be doing very little with his life. Now Mr. Pocket doesn't tutor him anymore, though they remain on good terms, and Pip of course keeps on meeting them. That is Pocket's family. Pip tries a few occupations but doesn't stick to any of them. Instead, he finds that he is spending a lot of time reading. One stormy night, a rough, sea-worn man of 60 comes to Pip's home. Before we discuss further details, let us read some relevant text. Now, this is how this old, rough, sea-worn man comes there. The narrator, Pip, says, "I listened again and heard the footsteps tumble in coming on. Remembering then that the staircase lights were blown out, I took up my reading lamp and went out to the stairhead. Whoever was below had stopped on seeing my lamp, for all was quiet. 'There is someone down there, is there not?' I called out. Looking down, 'Yes,' said a voice from the darkness beneath. 'What floor do you want?' 'The top, Mr. Pip.' 'That is my name.' 'There is nothing the matter.' 'Nothing the matter,' returned the voice, and the man came on. I stood with my lamp held out over the stair rail, and he came slowly within its light. It was a shaded lamp to shine upon a book, and its circle of light was very contracted, so that he was in it for a mere instant and then out of it. In the instant that I had seen a face that was strange to me, looking up with an incomprehensible air of being touched and pleased by the sight of me. Moving the lamp as the man moved, I made out that he was substantially dressed, but roughly, like a voyager by sea, that he had long iron grey hair, that his age was about 60, that he was a muscular man, strong on his legs, and that he was browned and hardened by exposure to weather. As he ascended the last stair or two, and the light of my lamp included us both, I saw with a stupid kind of amazement that he was holding out both his hands to me. 'Pray, what is your business?' I asked him. So the encounter with this strange man takes place even within more strange circumstances. What we notice is that the strange man's face is not very much visible to Pip in the dark night as he comes, because there is no light, no electricity, and Pip is just on the stairs, and Pip is just holding a reading lamp that has a small circle of light that it would make. And the moment in which this man entered into the circle of that light was very small, and as soon as he was out of it, again Pip could not see him clearly. However, what Pip noticed was that the man was looking at him in an admiring way. He was pleased to see him, and then Pip found when he reached upstairs that he was holding both his hands out to him. The text continues. My business? He repeated, pausing. Ah, yes, I will explain my business by your leave. Do you wish to come in? Yes, he replied, I wish to come in, master. I had asked him the question inhospitably enough, for I resented the sort of bright and gratified recognition that still shone in his face. I resented it because it seemed to imply that he expected me to respond to it. But I took him into the room I had just left, and having set the lamp on the table, asked him as civilly as I could to explain himself. He looked about him with the strangest air, an air of wondering pleasure, as if he had some part in the things he admired, and he pulled off a rough outer coat and his hat. Then I saw that his head was furrowed and bald, and that the long iron grey hair grew only on its sides. But I saw nothing that in the least explained him. On the contrary, I saw him next moment once more holding out both his hands to me. What do you mean? Said I, half suspecting him to be mad. He stopped in his looking at me and slowly rubbed his right hand over his head. It's disappointing to a man. Now look at the spellings of disappointing. This shows the pronunciation of the man who was saying actually disappointing. It's disappointing to a man, he said in a coarse, broken voice, after having looked forward. So after is after and forward is forward. Now this shows the language of a completely illiterate man belonging to the low class. So the language here is a clue to tell what kind of a person maybe this person can be. Anyhow, this person says, it is disappointing to a man, he said in a coarse, broken voice, after having looked forward. After having looked forward. This after is after. Forward is forward. So distant and come so far, but you are not to blame for that. Neither on us is to blame for that. I'll speak in half a minute. Give me half a minute, please. He sat down on a chair that stood before the fire and covered his forehead with his large brown veinous hands. I looked at him attentively then and recoiled a little from him, but I did not know him. There is no one nigh, said he, looking over his shoulder. Is there? Why do you, a stranger coming into my rooms at this time of the night, ask that question? Said I. You're a game one, he returned, shaking his head at me with a deliberate affection at once most unintelligible and most exasperating. I'm glad you'd grown up, a game one, but don't catch hold of me. You'd be sorry afterwards to have done it. Sorry afterwards, this is what it means. I relinquished the intention he had detected, for I knew him. Even yet I could not recall a single feature, but I knew him. If the wind and the rain had driven away the intervening years, had scattered all the intervening objects, had swept us to the churchyard where we first stood face to face on such different levels, I could not have known my convict more distinctly than I knew him now, as he sat in the chair before the fire. Even before the convict tells that he is the convict whom Pip helped in the graveyard, Pip was able to somehow instinctively recognize him. No need to take a file from his pocket and show it to me. No need to take the handkerchief from his neck and twist it round his head. No need to hug himself with both his arms and take a shivering turn across the room, looking back at me for recognition. I knew him before he gave me one of those aids, though a moment before I had not been conscious of remotely suspecting his identity. He came back to where I stood and again held out both his hands, not knowing what to do, for in my astonishment I had lost my self-possession. I reluctantly gave him my hands. He grasped them heartily, raised them to his lips, kissed them, and still held them. You acted noble, my boy, said he. Noble, Pip, and I have never forgot it. At a change in his manner, as if he were even going to embrace me, I laid a hand upon his breast and put him away. "Stay," said I, "keep off. If you are grateful to me for what I did when I was a little child, I hope you've shown your gratitude by mending your way of life. If you have come here to thank me, it was not necessary. Still, however you have found me out, there must be something good in the feeling that has brought you here." So this is the response of Pip. Dear students, actually I'm going to read a couple of more slides from the text, because this is very, very important text that would give you a feel of how both the convict and the Pip and the convict and because this would give you a feel how the convict and Pip feel. And I only repulse you, but surely you must understand that my intention was so attracted by the singularity of his fixed look at me that the words died away on my tongue. "He was saying," he observed, when we had confronted one another in silence, "that surely I must understand." What surely must I understand? "That I cannot wish to renew that chance intercourse with you of long ago under these different circumstances. I am glad to believe you have repented and recovered yourself. I am glad to tell you so. I am glad that, thinking I deserve to be thanked, you have come to thank me. But our ways are different. Our ways are different ways nonetheless. You are wet and you look weary. Will you drink something before you go?" So we can notice Pip's snobbish attitude. We can notice Pip is afraid of the presence of this man. We notice that Pip does not want to have the past connection re-established. We also notice that Pip wants him to leave as early as possible. He had replaced his neckerchief loosely and had stood, keenly observant of me, biting a long end of it. "I think," he answered, still with the end at his mouth and still observant of me, "that I will drink. I thank you afore I go." There was a tray ready on a side table. I brought it to the table near the fire and asked him what he would have. He touched one of the bottles without looking at it or speaking, and I made him some hot rum and water. Well, dear students, on this slide again you would see some text of the conversation of Pip and the convict that would reveal a lot about the relationship between them and how this relationship is being perceived now. "How are you living?" I asked him. "I've been a sheep farmer, stock breeder, other trades besides, away in the New World," said he, "many 1,000 miles of stormy water off from this." "I hope you have done well." "I've done wonderfully well. There's others went out alonger me as has done well too, but no man has done nigh as well as me. I'm famous for it." "I'm glad to hear it. I hope to hear you say so, my dear boy." Without stopping to try to understand those words or the tone in which they were spoken, I turned off to a point that had just come into my mind. "Have you ever seen a messenger you once sent to me?" I inquired, "since he undertook that trust." "Never set eyes upon him. I warn't likely to it. He came faithfully and he brought me the 2 one-pound notes. I was a poor boy then, as you know, and to a poor boy they were a little fortune. But like you, I have done well since, and you must let me pay them back. You can put them to some other poor boy's use." I took out my purse. He watched me as I laid my purse upon the table and opened it. And he watched me as I separated 2 one-pound notes from its contents. They were clean and new, and I spread them out and handed them over to him. Still watching me, he laid them one upon the other, folded them longwise, gave them a twist, set fire to them at the lamp, and dropped the ashes into the tray. Notice, please, the snobbery of Pip. Pip thinks what? Pip thinks that this man is thankful to him. He is thankful to him because Pip helped him. And one step ahead of all this, Pip also thinks that the £2 note that back many years back in his past was sent by this convict was a token of his thankfulness. And now that he is a rich man, he can return that money. So he gives him that back, snobbishly saying that he can put that to some other poor boy's use. And what the convict does in response to that, he just folds those 2 notes and puts them on fire. Soon, of course, they turn into ashes. "May I make so bold," he said then, with a smile that was like a frown, and with a frown that was like a smile, "as ask you how you have done well since you and me was out on them alone shivering marshes." The crucial question comes to Pip, कि आखिर किस तरह से अमीर हो गया है? How? He emptied his glass, got up and stood at the side of the fire with his heavy brown hand on the mantel shelf. He put a foot up to the bars to dry and warm it, and the wet boot began to stream. But he neither looked at it nor at the fire, but steadily looked at me. It was only now that I began to tremble. Ab the fear of the unknown captures Pip, I would say. When my lips had parted and had shaped some words that were without sound, I forced myself to tell him, though I could not do it distinctly, that I had been chosen to succeed to some property. "Might a mere varmint ask what property?" said he. I faltered. "I don't know." "Might a mere varmint ask whose property?" said he. I faltered again. "I don't know." "Could I make a guess, I wonder," said the convict, "at your income since you come of age? As to the first figure now, 5. So you see the guessing game he starts playing. अब वो उसको clues दे रहा है gradually who he is. The text continues on this slide again. "With my heart beating like a heavy hammer of disordered action, I rose out of my chair and stood with my hand upon the back of it, looking wildly at him. Concerning a guardian," he went on, "there ought to have been some guardian, or such like, whiles you was a minor. Some lawyer, maybe. As to the first letter of that lawyer's name now, would it be J?" अब वो उसको क्लूज दे रहा है कि तुम्हारा जो लॉयर होगा उसका नाम शायद जे से शुरू होता होगा. Of course, all this is frightening Pip, that after all, how this man knows all this. All the truth of my position came flashing on me, and its disappointments, dangers, disgraces, consequences of all kinds rushed in such a multitude that I was borne down by them and had to struggle for every breath I drew. Ab yakayak ekdam, it takes a minute for Pip to understand who actually the benefactor is. Or with this, the feelings of disappointment, danger, disgrace, and all other consequences attached to that, they all attack on him. The convict continues. "Put it," he resumed, "as the employer of that lawyer whose name began with a J and might be Jaggers. Put it as he had come overseas to Portsmouth and had landed there and had wanted to come on to you. However, you have found me out, you says just now. Well, however, did I find you out? Why, I wrote from Portsmouth to a person in London for particulars of your address. That person's name? Why, Wemmick." So he is revealing everything. All the suspense that has been built through the previous so many chapters is now leading towards the revelation of the truth. The mystery is being resolved, I would say. As far as the narrator Pip is concerned, he says, "I couldn't have spoken one word, though it had been to save my life. I stood with a hand on the chair back and a hand on my breast, where I seemed to be suffocating." So he was finding it hard to even breathe. "I stood so, looking wildly at him, until I grasped at the chair when the room began to surge and turn. He caught me, drew me to the sofa, put me up against the cushions, and bent on one knee before me, bringing the face that I now well remembered and that I shuddered at very near to mine. "Yes, Pip, dear boy, I have made a gentleman on you. It's me what has done it. I swore that time, sure as ever I earned a guinea, that guinea should go to you. I swore afterwards, that is afterwards, by the way, Sure as ever, I speculated and got rich, you should get rich. I lived rough, that you should live smooth. I worked hard, that you should be above work. What odds, dear boy? Do I tell it for you to feel obligation? Not a bit. I tell it for you to know as that their hunted Dangerous dog, what you keep life in, got his head so high that he could make a gentleman, and Pip, you are him. While he, the convict, is taking pride in his making of this gentleman, and he refers to the odds that he goes through, and actually he mentions that he does not want to mention these for the making Pip grateful, rather he takes honor in making Pip such a gentleman, and he can raise his head high for doing this. We can notice that Pip does not like the convict at all, even after this revelation. The abhorrence in which I held the man, the dread I had of him, the repugnance with which I shrank from him, could not have been exceeded if he had been some terrible beast. Looky here, Pip, I'm your second father, you are my son, more to me nor any son. I've put away money only for you to spend. When I was a hired out shepherd in a solitary hut, not seeing no faces but faces of sheep, till I half forgot what men's and women's faces was like, I see yon. I drops my knife many a time in that hut when I was eating my dinner or my supper, and I says, here's the boy again, looking at me whiles I eats and drinks. अब वो जो convict है वो अपनी पूरी कहानी, he is not only telling his story, वो अपनी पूरी कहानी नहीं बता रहा, he's talking about his emotions. That while working as a shepherd, when for days and days he would not be able to see a human face, he could imagine the face of Pip that would make him feel happy. He continues, I see you there many times, as plain as ever I see you on them misty marshes. Lord, strike me dead, I says each time, and I goes out in the air to say it under the open heavens. But what if I gets liberty and money? I'll make that boy a gentleman. And I done it. Why, look at you, dear boy, look at these here lodgings yon. Fit for a lord, ah, you shall show money with lords for beggars and beat them. So the convict is taking pride in what he has made of Pip, out of Pip, the gentleman that he has made, whereas Pip is still hating him very much and he wants to get rid of him. Anyhow, to conclude all this, I would say that Pip is horrified. All of his expectations are demolished. He has been living his life off the hard workings of a convict. There is no grand design by Miss Havisham to make Pip a happy and rich man living in harmonious marriage to Estella. All these illusions are coming to an end. He is disillusioned about all this. And he is surprised and shocked to know that Miss Havisham has no role in this. The convict tells Pip that he has come back to see him under threat of his life, since the law will execute him if they find him in England. Pip gives the convict Herbert's empty bed, then sits by the fire by himself, pondering his miserable position. There are a few quick discussion points with relation to this chapter. The chapter closes actually the second part of the novel, the second part of the journey of Pip's expectations. Great expectations comes to an end, and in the next session inshallah we would start the third part of Pip's journey. The irony is that the convict lived his life for Pip, worked his fingers to the bone to make Pip a gentleman. He did this based on the true act of kindness that Pip demonstrated when he gave the convict victuals to eat in the marshes. The convict reminds him, you acted noble, my boy, noble Pip. However, ironically, with all his money and education, now that Pip has become a gentleman and a noble man, he has lost all these traits of kindness. He has not valued his relationship with Joe and Biddy. This is what we have seen. It is even more horrifying to see how he reacts to this benefactor that he has. It confirms that Pip has become self-centered. He is an unkind, ungenerous and materialistic person. He seems to be very, very selfish in his approach towards the convict. Initially, he is very much angry with Miss Havisham, who misled him to believe her as his benefactor, but soon he starts realizing his own fault in this as well. He also realizes how badly he has treated Joe and Biddy. So we see that still there is a streak of goodness in him, and his conscience is there that actually pricks you see him for treating Joe and Biddy badly. All of Pip's great expectations prove to be false. He has also learned how he misbehaved with Joe and Biddy, yet there is a lot more for him to learn. And I think as you would move from part 2 to part 3, you would see that would be a part where we would see this learning taking place very quickly. What at this stage Pip does not understand is that the hierarchy of the class system says nothing about the nobleness of a person. A person be rich or be a poor person, this has nothing to do with leading a happy life. Indeed, he thinks he is ruined because he now associates himself with a convict, even though the convict has shown him nothing but kindness, and actually the convict has given his whole life after his first meeting with Pip to provide for Pip. He doesn't know what crime the convict committed. He only classifies him as less than common because of his label of convict, and for this reason he hates him. He still has to realize that Joe and Biddy and the convict are more noble people, more kind people, because they are more kind in their acts and more generous in their treatment of Pip. A lot of disillusionment is yet needed on the part of Pip. That is why Dickens finishes this part again with the line, "This is the end of the second stage of Pip's expectations." And as Dickens announces, this is the end of the second stage of Pip's expectations, I too come to the end of today's session that closes the second part of Pip's journey of great expectations. This is a list of references that are used and incorporated in the text that is prepared. Here is a quick review of the session that I would share before I close. In today's session, we continued part 2 and covered chapters 11 to 19 of this novel. Thus, we have finished part 2. We have explored the text of these chapters, we have looked at the themes, of course the development of characters and the relationship, the interrelationships I would say of the characters are looked at, and we analyzed the selected parts of text with relevance to all these points. So this is it for today. Here I close. Thank you very much and Allah Hafiz.